A new day is dawning here at Gettysburg, and I'm in front of the Eternal Peace Light. Today's episode of Civil War Reports has nothing to do about the Battle of Gettysburg. However, it will talk about how this battlefield helped bring peace to the Middle East. Hello and welcome back to my channel, Civil War Reports. I am your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. And today we're going to be taking a special look at the Gettysburg Battlefield. I'm going to refer to this episode as a Civil War Reports Special Edition, for we're not going to take a look at the Battle of Gettysburg itself, but rather how this battlefield helped bring about peace to the Middle East. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter paid two visits to the Gettysburg Battlefield. One was in July of 1978, shortly after the 4th of July, when he came here with his family. He was given a special tour by author Shelby Foote and battlefield technician Bob Prosperi, and I do hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. The second trip would come 2 months later, in September of that year. During that time, President Carter was engaged in what is probably the high water mark of his presidency, the Camp David Peace Accords. President Jimmy Carter was really hoping he could bring about peace to the Middle East. He invited Israeli Prime Minister Menachem and Egyptian President Anwar Sadat to Camp David, which is only a few miles from Gettysburg in Maryland. And he was hoping that he could broker a peace deal between these two nations. When the Camp David Accords were apparently breaking down and it appeared that no peace would be achieved, President Carter decided to have an outing. He was hoping that he could break the ice between Israel and Egypt by bringing them here to the Gettysburg Battlefield. He was hoping that a day out would help those two leaders, Menachem Begin of Israel, Anwar Sadat of Egypt, to see each other in a different light, to put them in an atmosphere that was peaceful and neutral, in an atmosphere that he was hoping would help those two men see each other not as leaders of different nations that were warring with each other, but rather just simply as human beings. That maybe here at Gettysburg, those two men could find some common ground to achieve a permanent and lasting peace. Today we're going to take a look at the two visits. I'm going to combine them into one episode for this special edition of Civil War Reports. Before occupying the White House, President Carter hailed from Georgia. He came from Plains, Georgia, where he was a peanut farmer, and he was also a former governor of that state. In July, he visited the Angle. That is the part of the battlefield where Pickett's men broke through the Union lines on Cemetery Ridge on July 3, 1863, but they were unable to hold their gains. While at the Angle, President Carter seemed very interested in knowing where Wright's brigade fought. Wright's brigade, like the president, were from Georgia. And it was on July 2nd of 1863 that Wright's brigade may or may not have broken through Union lines on Cemetery Ridge behind me. Wright, who was always quick to stroke his own ego, boasted that his one brigade was able to capture, but not hold, Cemetery Ridge. And this probably planted the seeds in General Lee's mind that if one brigade could get there, imagine what a more larger, grander attack could accomplish. But that is for a future episode. When President Carter paid his visit to the Gettysburg Battlefield in July, it is reported that he stood on top of this rock, right behind the monument for General Gouverneur K. Warren. As President Carter stood on that rock, looking out across the battlefield, he probably did not envision himself returning to this battlefield just 2 months later. But I'd like to think that as he stood on this rock, and looked out, he saw not only the rolling hills and valleys in front of him and beautiful South Mountain in the distance, he saw something more. He saw a chance for peace. A chance for peace between Israel and Egypt. A chance to bring about a permanent and lasting peace between two nations. When I was in graduate school working on my Master's of Arts in History, I took a class on the Middle East, and I had a professor who was nice enough to allow me to do my term paper on the Camp David Peace Accords. It was during that research that I first discovered that President Carter made this trip here to Gettysburg along with the Israeli Prime Minister and the Egyptian President. According to my research, both men enjoyed their trip here, but apparently Anwar Sadat might have enjoyed it a little more, asking a lot more questions, and seemed very fascinated with the battlefield. A few days later, Camp David Peace Accords would be signed in the White House Rose Garden, bringing about peace, at least between Israel and Egypt. Gettysburg is often considered the high water mark of the Confederacy, and I'd also like to think that Camp David Peace Accords were really the high point of President Carter's administration. While he could not foresee all of the problems that he would face during his administration, such as stagflation, the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant disaster, which is only about 30 or 40 miles from Gettysburg Battlefield, the way the crow flies, and certainly could not foresee the Iran hostage crisis. I'm really hoping the history books will be much kinder to President Carter than the newspapers were. A few years ago, I wrote to President Carter, and he actually wrote back, and I'm very grateful for that. Since leaving office, President Carter has been very busy working with Habitat for Humanity to try to build homes for the less fortunate. I'd like to think that at the Camp David Peace Accords, he brought about peace to the less fortunate. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter paid 2 visits to hear the Virginia State Memorial. It was the first Confederate monument placed here at Gettysburg. It's also the largest of all the Confederate state monuments on the Gettysburg Battlefield. In my opinion, it's a very beautiful monument. On top sits the great General Robert E. Lee, mounted on his favorite warhorse, Traveler. I'd like to think that when the Prime Minister of Israel and the President of Egypt came to this battlefield and came to this monument, they looked across the field in which Pickett's charge took place. A field in which thousands of men were killed, wounded, taken prisoner, and permanently scarred both mentally and physically for the rest of their lives. And I'd like to think that looking upon those fields, they realized how wasteful war can be. Just a few days after this visit here, the Camp David Peace Accords came to a successful conclusion, with Israel and Egypt signing a lasting peace, and brought peace to at least a small part of the Middle East. I'm filming this in the year 2022. That peace between Israel and Egypt has held up now for 44 years, and there's no sign of it ending anytime soon. I'd like to think that this monument helped play a role in bringing about peace in the Middle East. I'd like to think that this monument really helped break the ice between Menachem and Anwar Sadat. So for those people who say that these monuments have no place in American history or any history, in my opinion, are just wrong. This monument, in my opinion, helped break the ice, helped bring about peace. So to those haters of history who want to tear these monuments down, maybe you want to stop and think about how these monuments can still play a role in not only remembering and preserving American history, but help bringing about peace around the world. You don't have to love the cause, but we should never forget what happened. Because after all, those who forget the past are condemned to repeat it. I promise in a future episode I will take a look at the desecration of monuments around the United States. Because again, you may not like what the war was fought about, but we should never forget that the war was fought. When President Carter decided to make the trip here to Gettysburg during the Camp David peace accords, he had but one rule. That rule was that the Camp David accords were not to be discussed during the trip. Did he do this for security reasons? Possibly. But he also had a larger reason in mind. He wanted to be a day of thawing the tensions between the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem, and the Egyptian President, Anwar Sadat. And his plan was successful. As mentioned earlier, just a few days later in the White House Rose Garden, the Camp David Accords were signed and peace came between Israel and Egypt. But peace comes with a price. And President Anwar Sadat paid the ultimate price on October 6, 1981, when he was assassinated by a military coup. The Israeli Prime Minister would outlive him by about 10 and a half years, succumbing to a heart attack on March 9, 1992. Of the three leaders that met here at Gettysburg, who came to this sacred soil to try to find peace in the Middle East, only President Carter remains with us. Later this year, he will turn 98 years old. And I wish upon him that his reward for bringing peace in the Middle East and using Gettysburg, a place that I love so much, to bring about that peace, that I truly hope he makes it to at least 100, if not longer. And I hope that he will continue to have the physical and mental ability to continue on doing the good work that he has done so long in his life. For Civil War Reports, I'm your War of the Rebellion reporter, Brian Thomas Kopak. Until next time, thank you. And if you'd like to read up more on this topic, the main sources I used to bring this episode to you were Keeping Faith, Memoirs of a President by President Jimmy Carter, A Man of Peace, Anwar Sadat by George Carpozzi Jr., as well as a newspaper article from the Gettysburg Daily, and numerous academic journal articles that I used when writing my term paper on this in graduate school. And if you like what you saw today, please hit the subscribe button, give a thumbs up. Also, notify your friends, let them know about this channel, and ask them to subscribe as well. If you like, you may leave a question or a comment below, and perhaps I will answer your question in a future episode of Civil War Reports. Until next time, please keep the history alive.